Today we're looking at the movement known as Surrealism. While it originated in Europe, we looked at the way that this movement had already touched the art of Frida Kahlo when we discussed her process, her projects, even though she rejected that term. The word surrealism is something that we take for granted. You go to an amazing event and it's so great that someone is likely to say this is surreal. It means something different when used that way than what we're going to delve into today. So just keep that difference in mind. The surrealistic movement that we are examining, the place where the term surrealism originated from, was born in the 1920s, as have been so many of the avant-garde movements we looked at so far. This one, however, began as a literary movement that experimented with a new mode of expression called automatic writing, or automatism. The movement's aim was to release the creative force of the unconscious. Using Freudian methods of free association, the surrealist writers, poetry and prose, drew directly upon what was seen as the very private world of the mind that had been traditionally restricted by reason, societal limitations, etc. Drawing on that source, that untapped, seemingly captivated wealth of energy, vitality, and human creativity, the surrealist artists that we'll examine today used or drew upon that source to produce surprising and unexpected imagery. The movement begins in Europe with surrealist poets André Breton, Paul Éluard, and Louis Aragon, among many others, who tried to write in a hypnotic or trance-like state. And as they went through this process, they recorded their train of mental associations without censorship, without judgment, or any attempts at formal exposition like rhyming or the traditional modes of grammatical thinking. These poets were deeply influenced by Freudian psychoanalytic theory, which was on the rise in the early 1920s. This new science, this new understanding of the human mind unleashed something heretofore unknown. It's one of the first steps, at least in European thought, where the mind is thought to have its outward-facing persona, the consciousness, outward-facing even to the person themselves, and then this inner subconscious, this almost other within the same body. Tapping this strange or incongruous part of the mind. The surrealists thought that they could record the unconscious forces, those psychic forces, that would possess a new form of artistic significance. Take a look at these images in front of you. In a sense, right, they're simple. You can see that they're done with some sort of colored pencil type of material on very plain paper. We can see the creases in the paper. It's been folded into thirds and then folded into further sections. We have this set up for what is actually a type of game. What we're looking at is automatic drawing, which came from the tenets of automatic writing and from Dadaism, another art movement before this. In the automatic drawings we're seeing here, which also extended to painting, the goal was the suspension of control of reason. Any time the rational mind came into play, it would be stopped so that the unconscious could flow freely. This was one of the surrealist tactics for intentionally avoiding logic and rationalism. The cerebral and irrational tenets of surrealism find their ancestry in the clever and fanciful disregard for tradition, fostered by Dadaism, as I mentioned, and by other regional modes of thought. So just what is it that we're looking at? It's the start of a drawing, sometimes with multiple authors, multiple artists involved. You've probably played this game yourself, where you draw some sort of squiggly line, you pass the paper on to the person next to you, and they find something out of that line and start to create a new form. As you keep passing the paper back and forth, suddenly this mess of squiggles becomes a fish in a fishbowl. Something that you couldn't have anticipated from the start from your initial line. That's what's happening in these drawings here. And what's recorded is the gameful conglomeration of Andre Breton, Oscar Dominguez, Max Ernst, Wilfredo Lam, who will examine further, and a series of other artists who played this game together on a boat leaving Europe and headed for the Caribbean. In 1938, Andre Breton, the founder of Surrealism, traveled to Mexico to meet two very important people, which we see here on the left. Diego Rivera, who was already well known as an artist in Paris, and of course in Mexico, and Leon Trotsky, who had played a leading role together with Lenin during the 1917 Russian Revolution, which overthrew the Russian Empire and marked the origin of the Soviet Union. We'll need just a quick Russian history here to understand the importance of Trotsky in this image that I'm showing you on the screen. As you may know, after the Russian Civil War, which lasted from 1918 to 1923, the death of Lenin in 1924, the Soviet Union remained isolated, and the economical conditions required for the rapid expanse of the nation's economy under socialism just didn't exist. In this situation, a bureaucratic counter-revolution that raised itself above the working class, the same working class that the communist revolution had fought for, was led by Stalin. And you may just know a bit about Stalin or have an image of Stalin or even an emotional reaction when you hear his name. He slaughtered hundreds of thousands of his own people as part of this fear-mongering and fear that their very new form of government was going to be overthrown. So the struggle between the Stalinist faction and the leftist opposition, the group that wanted to stay true to the workers' movement, this was led by Trotsky. And the struggle between these representatives of the working class, in Trotsky's case, and the bureaucratic elite, in the case of Lenin, was escalated, to say the least. In 1929, as a result of this struggle, Trotsky was expelled from the Communist Party and deported with his wife from the Soviet Union. He lived in Turkey, then took refuge in France, then Norway. In 1936, due to Diego Rivera's petitioning of the Mexican president, he was cleared for protection in Mexico. Rivera, as we've discussed before, was an activist and a leader in the Mexican Communist Party until 1922, when he was kicked out. And he was, at first, the gateway for Trotsky and Andre Breton to come to Mexico. Breton himself had participated in a different kind of protest against the persecution of Lenin's followers. Again, anti-Stalinists. And he was a full supporter of Trotsky's idea of the ongoing revolution. Breton attempted to keep surrealism in relationship with Marxism, but absolutely free of Stalinism. So you can imagine the discussion between these three men inside the family home of Frida Kahlo, where Trotsky lived for quite a while and Breton visited briefly. During this visit, the reason for this history in the class that I'm teaching you is that Breton, Rivera, and Trotsky in 1938 wrote their own manifesto titled Toward a Free Revolutionary Art, which provoked the foundation of a new organization in Mexico. Just think about that for a minute. One of the most famous, even most infamous leaders in politics, in global politics, certainly in the communist world, sits together with Diego Rivera, one of the famed muralists of post-revolutionary Mexico. And then here we have thinker and surrealist Andre Breton, and they decide to write a manifesto about art and politics. It's a rare meeting of minds and interests. The claims of their manifesto were these: that surrealism presents itself not as an art movement, but as a movement whose true aim is revolutionary change. Surrealism's project attempted to unify two paths that were conventionally thought of as separate: politics and aesthetics. And it did so to provoke a crisis in the bourgeois consciousness, which reduced all of life to market values, religious impostures, universal boredom and misery, according to the three. For them, surrealism, pure psychic automatism, intended to express verbally, in writing, or by other means, the real functioning of thought. The dictation of thought in the absence of all control exercised by reason and outside all aesthetic or moral preoccupations. What are they driving at? Why the need to get around the boundaries of the rational mind? Part of what's happening, we are moving between Mexico and Europe, and both regions are experiencing a failure in rationalism. Mexico, of course, has just been through an absolutely brutal civil war, which challenged all rational thought. Europe is coming out of World War I. The same has happened there. And the idea among these thinkers, interrogators of political life, interrogators of humanity itself, is that, okay, rational thought didn't work. Everything that we built our societies on, all those structures, all those hopes, they broke down. Somehow we became brutal. We became fighters, one against another. And they were looking for an alternative, another way to find something redeemable in humanity. You've watched The Case for Surrealism before beginning this lecture, and just hold there the key points that they noted were inherent to surrealism's tactics. One of the first we see here in the work of Max Ernst and Man Ray. Take a minute with the images. The surrealists understood the body to be a linchpin. It's the very site where the mundane, the logical, and understandable world breaks down and collides with something sensing, irrational, and driven by unconscious motives and desires. The surrealists understood the body, particularly the female body, as a site which undermined capitalism's division of public and private, political and poetic, rational and the irrational. It's important to note, as is clear in the images and the artist names, that most of the founders at the beginning of the surrealist movement were men. And this heightened focus on the female body, on desire, on drive, and this gazing at women in their work it's part of that gender division at the outset. There are women who are surrealists, and there are men who became the subject of surrealist thought. On the male side of thinking, or looking at male bodies, this is where the idea of the automaton comes in. This rational, logical, almost computerized. They wouldn't have said it at the time, but automaton is the word for that. This sort of set of code that just works itself out without intervention. So we have this split gendering in surrealism itself. The mannequin became a very important visual trope for the surrealists because it evoked the female body remade as a commodity, one that was frozen, that could be fetishized, that could be turned into a corpse, revealing then not pleasure or desire, but fear and terror. The drive to get at emotions for the surrealists is huge because they see the breakdown of rationalism in the expression, the full-bodied expression of emotion. Here we see that fascination with mannequins playing out. The Surrealists frequently held massive pan-national group exhibitions, and for their 1938 show held in Paris, 15 different artists put 15 wax mannequins, meant to incarnate the feminine ideal, into fantastical get-ups, as we see one here on the right. This aspect of surrealism was particularly significant for most of the Latin American avant-garde, for whom modernism up to this point was investigated largely through the body and figuration already, rather than through pure abstraction. Looking at these images, what do you think about this use of the body as a site to investigate the workings of capital and the unconscious? What do you think about the gendering that's going on? When the founder of Surrealism, André Breton, encountered Frida Kahlo's work, he thought he had found in Mexico, and in Frida in particular, something of a pure, unbridled source of this alternate mode of feeling and thinking and expressing that was unhinged from tradition and from societal norms. Looking at the two images here, you can see how, of course, Breton saw the mannequins from 1938 when he saw Kahlo's broken column. It doesn't mean that that's how Kahlo saw it. For Breton, though, he, arriving in Mexico, felt like he had found his people. You can see it in this quote, right? There's a country where creation has been prodigal, with undulations of the ground and species of plant life, and has surpassed itself with its range of seasons and cloud architectures, where for a whole century now the word independence has continued to crackle. I had long been impatient to go there, to put to the test the idea I had formulated of the kind of art our own era demanded, an art that would intentionally sacrifice the external model to the internal model, that would resolutely give perception precedence over representation. What's he talking about? Giving perception precedence over representation. Send me your thoughts on that. Looking at the work that Breton encountered in Diego Rivera and in Kahlo, it's clear why he thought the way he did. It's clear why he thought, oh, here I am seeing this opening up, this thing beyond the rational, this incredibly emotive, bizarre, unhindered way of looking and seeing. I mean, just take that image on the left of Rivera's. Keep in mind this is an illustration for Breton's work. It almost first appears as a face, but as you look more and more closely, perhaps those black tree-like forms show us in a forest. Is this middle thing something with roots? Is it a treed structure? Where are those hands and eyeballs coming from? It is this crazy, psychedelic, unbridled image. And as I said before when we touched on surrealism in the work of Kahlo, it's something we're used to now. We see people drawing emotively from angsty teenagers to world famous artists. But coming off of the Victorian era, coming off of the colonial period, all the strictures that were in place, this kind of work was radical. The artist Antonin Artaud said, "The present civilization of Europe is in a state of bankruptcy. Europe no longer has anything to offer the world but an incredible pulverization of cultures. There remains only Mexico and her subtle political structure, which has not changed fundamentally since the age of Montezuma." What is this European guy saying? Along with Breton, Artaud, and many of the surrealists looked to Latin America, many of the 20th century avant-garde looked to Latin America as this fertile, naive, untouched, primitive, in the worst sense of that word, land where all the errors of so-called grown-up Europe had yet to be borne out. It's a racist view. It's one deeply set in colonialism, but it does structure the way that surrealism looked at the work of Latin Americans, and we want to push back and show the way that Latin Americans projected their works themselves. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, writing from Colombia, looked in reverse and said, European rationalism prevents them, these European surrealists, these European artists, from seeing that reality isn't limited to the price of tomatoes and eggs. Everyday life in Latin America proves that reality is full of the most extraordinary things. For Marquez, Latin America is a place where the problem is not to create or to invent imaginary scenarios as the surrealists from Europe were doing. Rather, the problem is the reverse, to make credible their rich, multivalent reality. All right, so let's look at the work of some of the artists from Latin America who did align themselves with the surrealist mode of touching the unconscious, of breaking through rational hindrances through their work. Take a minute with this image. The title tells you what's happening. It's called Angels in a Truck by Manuel Alvarez Bravo from 1930. And here we have two statuary traveling through the streets of Mexico City in the back of a truck bed, right? A spot where one might generally find workers or other types of cargo. Just the immediate kick of this image, it says something funny, right? Here are these angels also doing the work in the back of the truck bed, traveling through town, not with wings, but through the use of a truck. Bravo is trying to tap into the uncanny. The uncanny, as you saw in that opening video on surrealism, is the thing that seems familiar suddenly displaced and not familiar at all anymore. It's that moment when you think you've known someone for ages and they say just something and you realize in that split second, I don't know you at all. That's the uncanny, that absolutely unfamiliar in the thing that has always seemed familiar. And that's what's going on in this image of the truck, right? You have an image of trucks, they don't carry angels. You have an image of angels, they don't ride in trucks. Here it is parading through Mexico City. Here's another image. At first glance, it's difficult to know if this is a woman standing up peering into a window, or is she lying on a floor looking into the abyss, looking into a hole that goes all the way to the other side of the earth, or pulls her into another dimension. This is the way of thinking that surrealists are capturing in their images. Just the bizarre. And this one. As a photograph, it might seem harmless, but look at all those eyes looking back at you. In this image, we can say that photography functions as a documentary itself, giving factual status to the world of the marvelous and the mad that is already all around us. What about this one? This one takes a little bit of Spanish language knowledge, right? A comedor is like a lunch place, but it's also one who eats, one who is eating. And at a quick glance, right, we can't see these people's heads. Are they being chomped by that roll down door that could be a mouth? Have those men lost their heads? In that sort of tongue-in-cheek kind of way? All of these things are at play in that image. Women took part actively in this mode of image making as well. Graciela Iturbide, who we're looking at here, is one such artist. She continues the tradition of Alvarez Bravo, whose work we just saw, in presenting the everyday and documenting the uncanny in the world around her. You can see that in this image, right? We have this girl, and we have this giant comb in her head. There's humor. Is she undersized? Is the comb oversized? What's happening? And then we have this forbidden element, right, of the towel and what's happening there. Iturbide is an artist. Her career started in 1979 when the renowned Mexican painter Francisco Toledo asked her to do a series of photographs of his own hometown in Juchitán in Oaxaca. Iturbide focused on the matriarchal nature of that Zapotec community and documented the powerful role of women in this society. Women as healers, as political leaders, as merchants. Iturbide is part of a cultural continuum of Mexican artists and writers, from Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo to Rufino Tamayo and Toledo, who have attempted to rip away their country's colonial mask and expose its underlying indigenous realities. What that lends is originality to Iturbide's work. It's her conviction that traditional societies are strong enough to withstand the intrusion of the modern world. And we see that in this beautiful play of imagery. Here's another fantastical work by her. Coming from the difficult, revolutionary subjects that we've been studying, you have to shift gears a bit with surrealism. You have to let your emotions read the image. You have to take on that fantastical quality within yourself in order to see it here. What is this, right? What's being shown? We can imagine she's a woman on the street showing iguanas, wearing this hat. What in the world is happening? Or is she a Medusa-like form, right? Is she some sort of goddess of the iguanas? Just in her very presence, she transforms the ordinary into something surreal. Something that It makes you look twice, at least. Mexico wasn't the only source of surrealism in Latin America. It appeared in Brazil as well. And what it did in Brazil was to reinvigorate the cannibalist movement that we looked at earlier in the class. Take a minute with this image and tell me how you see that happening. We have this bizarre collage, right, of a figure in a deep sea diving helmet holding on to this head that's strung with all sorts of wires or metal rods. It's as if they've taken their own head, right? Is this a cannibalist eating themselves, or is it a cannibalist other that's collected this woman's head from somewhere? What's happening? In Chile, artists like Roberto Mata use surrealism to represent the human psyche in paint. Here we see these almost furniture-like pieces, stairs, pieces of wood, deep sort of basement spaces, things that look like mousetraps, even torture devices. This play of light and color, different dimensions, different layers, different spaces in the mind. But Mata also joined together with the Ramona Parra Brigade to create what you're seeing here, or more than what you're seeing here. But this mural is called The First Goal of the Chilean People, and it was painted around a public swimming pool to commemorate the 1-year anniversary of Salvador Allende, his election to the presidency in Chile, but also his death, as opposition, with U.S. support, stormed the presidential palace and forced him into resignation, and it's unclear whether it was a murder or a suicide. Painting the first goal of the Chilean people, Mata says they used paint and airbrushes against the machine guns of Augusto Pinochet, the dictator who followed after the death of Allende. Just think about that opposition, right? Paint and airbrushes against machine guns. It's nothing. Dictator Pinochet ordered the elimination of this mural, which he understood was directly in support of Allende, who he had overthrown. But the mural was restored in 2005. Let's move on to Cuba. We're seeing a picture here of André Breton on the left, Wilfredo Lam, and Mantil in Haiti in 1944. Wilfredo Lam is a fantastic figure in modernist art. His work, I absolutely love his work. He is a Cuban. His father was Chinese, and his mother was of mixed West African, Indian, as in from India, and European descent. He lived in Paris and studied with Picasso. He met Breton. He's part of this like upper crust of the artistic elite in Europe at the time. World War II, the Nazis, the absolute racialization of the population in Europe during the 1940s forced him to flee back to the Caribbean. Let's look at Lam's work. We saw some of it here in these drawings. But in full force, Lam's work, as you're seeing it here, is this almost alchemical mix of political liberation for the global South, surrealism, and Afro-Cuban religious culture. Lamb's personal awareness of the difficulties of staking out artistic identity as specifically Afro-Cuban in France gave him a very special insight into surrealist projects of devaluing European rationalist culture under capitalism, and allowed him to see the colonialism inherent in so many modes of thinking as indispensable to that global through the spread of capitalism. We see an attack on both of these structures in his work. So tell me what you see here. First, right, we have this wash of greens and blue, orange, hints of yellow. It's the depth of field in this painting is very shallow. We don't have an idea that the figures or the landscape recedes far into the distance. We're not seeing mountains miles and miles away, right? We're seeing a very close image that's pushed to the front of the canvas. As we look closer, hands and feet, rounded buttocks and breasts, fruit and other forms appear. And then as we look even closer, there are a series of faces, right? On the far left, we have this combination, this anthropomorphic figure that has one foot or arm raised along the very leftmost edge of the canvas. And then feet elongated to the ground with very little body in between, right? We're seeing sort of the backside of this figure and then its elongated face. Move over a little bit and we've got another kind of moon-like face and a body whose arms and legs are going in multiple directions. To the right of that, we have another figure that seems to have almost like a cat-like face coming over the top of another face that has a kind of hanging goatee. It's a mix of verdant forms, anthropomorphic forms, and these culminate in the figure on the right. We see definitely the crescent moon shape, the body, the long arms, legs, feet, the back, and then this hand that reaches up with a pair of scissors. This work of art is one of Lamb's absolute masterpieces. Here, in this setting, a piece called The Jungle is not set in a jungle at all, or it's set in a remade jungle. The figures are there amongst sugarcane, and they represent and are part of the melding of the sugar cane laborers who were no longer allowed to practice Santeria in Cuba. These West African descendants were forbidden from their own religion, and in order to practice it in real life, they would go out into the sugar fields and cut a small section in the middle of the fields where they wouldn't be found to take on their practices. More and more and more is going on in this painting, as in fact the representatives here each take on the form of a different orisha, or god or goddess form, or deity in the Yoruba practices. They're playing instruments, they're celebrating. At the same time, those very sexualized forms that we see throughout, very rounded buttocks, the breast forms that are almost replicating fruits and vegetables at times, speak to Lamb's frustration with the population of his home island, who he felt had been pressured into modes of prostitution, both of selling their labor and selling their bodies in the face of the American capitalists who were there taking over Cuba in the time that Lamb was in Europe. And so we see in Lamb this Cuban of global descent, this kind of unfettered state of mind comes about in the works, right? From the exuberant religious figures that we see, these various orisha that we see, highly sexualized imagery, things that are true to the practices of the West Africans and the descendants who lived in Cuba that were never read or seen or understood by any of the colonizing companies, countries, and peoples who came there. In a way, Lamb's work is the conjunction of both surrealism and a form of art and an art movement called negritude that celebrated the West African heritage of so many of the peoples on the islands of Cuba, the Dominican Republic, so many spots throughout the Caribbean. Lamb's vocabulary of vegetable animal forms was inspired directly by this Yoruba set of deities, and he worked with the nationalist poets of the negritude movement in order to celebrate native culture. Here we see one of those forms, right? Is it an animal? Is it a plant? What's going on? We have a human breast. We have what looks like the female waist, thighs, and body, lower body of a female form. And at the top we have this sharp, almost knife shape or plow shape, reflecting Zambezia, one of the goddesses, one of the entities in Yoruba practice. Here we see so many of those forms again. This piece, called The Rumblings of the Earth, represents a synthesis of Lamb's concerns in his work in the 1940s. This painting melds his reaction to the European artistic legacy with his own goals and traditions from his home country. In this piece, Lamb is looking at Guernica through direct quotations and abstract correspondences, and he's transforming Picasso's political statement by replacing the central victim of Guernica, the horse, with a spectral presence bearing a large knife. Can you see it? And it's an aggressive painting. It includes all these vaginal and phallic references that focus the work on the cycle of birth and death, while also suggesting some sort of ritual initiation and violence. What we see from Lamb's image is that violence was a means of liberation, something that the Yoruba people called upon and understood in their deities. That pair of scissors in La Jungla, the painting that we looked at that's set in the sugarcane, the pair of scissors was to cut the bind, not only of the slavery which had come before, but the continued colonization of the islands of Cuba by outsiders. For Lamb, revolutionary violence, it was a means of liberation, and in his hands, the victim in Picasso's canvas has instead become the aggressor. This is Guernica. For those of you who don't know the background on this piece, this was a protest piece, one of Picasso's only protest pieces. After the town of Guernica was slaughtered by Franco. You see here the anguish of the people, all these forms, they're not quite fully human. There's a surrealist quality to the anguish, the bodies, the lamentation, that almost ghost-like set of figures, just expressing pain, loss, and victimhood. Something Picasso was trying to show the government that they had done to their own people. Take a minute and go back to the slide of Lamb's piece and see that dialogue. See the way he's transferred this same injustice, this way that Picasso is trying to communicate of this horrible disservice to one's own people. See how Lamb transfers that into strength, into the possibility of righting that wrong. It's a fantastic way that art and politics come together in this surrealist mode.